The United States of America, the land of the free, home of the brave, and, as every American schoolchild learns, a nation of exactly 50 states. You've seen the flag, 50 stars, one for each state. It's been that way since 1960, when Hawaii officially joined the Union. But here's a question that maps don't answer, that flags don't show, and that history textbooks tend to gloss over. Today, we're going on a journey through war and empire, through colonial history and political debate, to answer one deceptively simple question. Does the United States really have 50 states? Or is the true number something else entirely? And at the center of this story is one island whose history is unlike anything else in the American story. An island of 3 million people, of rich culture, of incredible resilience, and of an unresolved question that has stretched on for over 125 years. This is the story of Puerto Rico, and the story of why the United States might, depending on how you count, have 55 states.
To understand the puzzle of America's territories, we first need to understand how the United States grew. It started with 13 colonies strung along the Atlantic coast. When they declared independence from Britain in 1776, the new nation covered roughly 430,000 square miles, a fraction of what it would become today. The expansion came fast. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson struck what may be the greatest real estate deal in history, the Louisiana Purchase. France sold 828,000 square miles of North American territory for just $15 million, roughly 3 cents an acre. The United States doubled overnight. Florida came next, purchased from Spain in 1819. Then Texas joined in 1845. California and the Southwest followed after the Mexican-American War ended in 1848. Alaska was bought from Russia in 1867 for just over $7 million, a deal mocked at the time as Seward's folly. And in 1959, the last 2 stars were added to the flag. Alaska in January, Hawaii in August. 50 stars, 50 states. The nation was complete. Or was it? Because while the 50-state map was being drawn, the United States was also holding on to a collection of islands across the Caribbean and the Pacific, territories it had acquired not by purchase or peaceful negotiation, but through war. Islands full of people who were, by law, American, but who held a very different kind of American citizenship than anyone living in the rest of the U.S.
So where does the number 55 come from? Here's the breakdown. The United States officially recognizes 5 major inhabited territories: Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, Guam in the Western Pacific, the United States Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, American Samoa in the South Pacific, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, also in the Pacific. 50 states plus 5 territories. That's where the number 55 originates. Now, to be absolutely clear, these are not states. The U.S. government does not call them states. Their residents do not have the same rights as state residents, but they are American. They fly the American flag, they use the U.S. dollar, they serve in the U.S. military at higher rates per capita than many states. Here's the key difference. If you live in one of the 50 states, say Kansas or Vermont or Nevada, you have full representation in the U.S. Congress. You have 2 senators, you have representatives in the House, and every 4 years, you cast a vote that counts in the Electoral College for President of the United States. If you live in a territory, say Puerto Rico, with its 3 million residents, you have 1 non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives.
0 senators. And when it comes to presidential elections, your vote simply does not count. 4 million people across these 5 territories, 0 electoral votes. The question of whether this is just, whether it's compatible with American democratic values, is at the heart of one of the longest-running debates in U.S. history. To understand how all of this happened, we need to travel back to the spring of 1898, to one of the most consequential and underappreciated years in American history. Spain had once controlled the greatest empire in the world. At its peak, Spanish territory stretched across South America, Central America, the Caribbean, the Philippines, and beyond. But by the late 1800s, Spain was a fading power, and its colonies were restless. In Cuba, a fierce independence movement had been fighting Spanish colonial rule. The United States watched with great interest, partly out of genuine sympathy for Cuban self-determination, and partly out of significant economic interest. American businesses had invested heavily in Cuban sugar plantations. Then, on February 15, 1898, the USS Maine, an American battleship anchored in Havana Harbor, exploded. 266 American sailors were killed. The cause was never definitively established, but American newspapers, led by the sensationalist journalism of William Randolph Hearst, blamed Spain. The rallying cry became, "Remember the Maine." The Spanish-American War lasted just 113 days. It was, in the words of Secretary of State John Hay, a splendid little war. The United States won decisively on every front, and when the fighting was over, the world had changed. Under the Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba was granted nominal independence, though American influence over the island would remain strong for decades. In the span of a single year, the United States had transformed from a continental power into a colonial empire, with 4 million new subjects scattered across the globe. And unlike previous acquisitions like Louisiana or Alaska, these territories were not on a path to statehood. They occupied a legal no-man's land, and the Supreme Court would soon make that official. Between 1901 and 1922, the Supreme Court issued a series of rulings known as the Insular Cases. The central question: did the Constitution, with all its rights and protections, automatically apply to residents of newly acquired territories? The court's answer was deeply troubling. No, not automatically. The justices ruled that territories could be unincorporated, meaning they belonged to the United States, but were not considered part of it in the fullest constitutional sense. Critics called it the legal architecture of empire. The effects of those rulings are still felt today. Of all the territories that make up this story of 55, none has a longer, richer, or more complex history than Puerto Rico, and none has a more unresolved relationship with the United States. So let's give this island the time it deserves. Long before the United States existed, Puerto Rico had already lived through centuries of colonial history. The island was home to the Taíno people for at least 1,000 years before European contact. They called their island Boriken, a name still used today as a proud symbol of Puerto Rican identity. When Christopher Columbus arrived on his second voyage in 1493, the Taíno world was about to change forever. Spanish colonization of Puerto Rico began in earnest in 1508, led by Juan Ponce de León,
The same explorer, later famous for supposedly searching for the Fountain of Youth in Florida. The Taino population was decimated by European diseases, forced labor, and violence within just a few generations. Spain built Puerto Rico into a strategically vital possession, a gateway to the Americas. The massive fortress of El Morro, begun in 1539, still stands at the entrance to San Juan Harbor. The Spanish spent nearly 400 years building, defending, and developing the island. By the 19th century, Puerto Rico was developing a distinct national identity. Puerto Rican intellectuals, writers, and activists began pushing for autonomy. The most famous of these was Ramón Emeterio Betances, known as the father of Puerto Rican nationalism, who organized the Grito de Lares, the Cry of Lares, in 1868. It was a short-lived uprising against Spanish rule, but it became a defining moment in Puerto Rican national consciousness. In 1897, Spain finally granted Puerto Rico a charter of autonomy, a significant degree of self-governance. For the first time, Puerto Rico had its own parliament, its own government. It was a milestone that had taken nearly 4 centuries to achieve. It lasted less than a year.
On July 25, 1898, just 2 months after Puerto Rico's autonomous government had held its very first session, American troops landed at the town of Guanaca on Puerto Rico's southern coast. For many Puerto Ricans, the arrival of American forces was initially welcomed. After 4 centuries of Spanish rule, the prospect of a new relationship with a modern, democratic republic seemed hopeful. Some Puerto Rican leaders believed the United States might even offer statehood or independence. Those hopes were quickly disappointed. The Treaty of Paris transferred Puerto Rico to the United States not as a future state, not as an independent nation, but as what the treaty called an unorganized territory. The island's political status was left entirely to the discretion of the U.S. Congress. For nearly 2 decades after 1898, Puerto Ricans were classified as American nationals, not citizens. They could not vote in U.S. elections, could not receive U.S. passports, and had no representation in Congress. That changed in 1917 with the passage of the Jones-Shafrath Act, also known simply as the Jones Act. The act granted U.S. citizenship to Puerto Ricans. It established a locally elected legislature. It extended many constitutional protections to the island. But the timing was not a coincidence. The United States had just entered World War I. The Jones Act was signed in March 1917, and almost immediately, Puerto Rican men became eligible and were drafted into the United States Armed Forces. More than 18,000 Puerto Ricans served in World War I. They fought for a country in which they had no political voice. This tension between military obligation and political exclusion would define Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States for the next century. Not all Puerto Ricans accepted the American colonial framework peacefully. The most powerful voice of resistance in the 20th century belonged to Pedro Albizu Campos, a Harvard Law graduate, a decorated World War I veteran, and the president of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. Albizu Campos was a brilliant, passionate, and deeply controversial figure. He rejected any status short of full independence for Puerto Rico. He argued that the United States had never had the legal right to take the island, and that Puerto Rican sovereignty had simply been stolen. In 1950, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party launched an armed uprising against U.S. rule. Revolts broke out across several towns. Later that year, on November 1st, two Puerto Rican nationalists, Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola, attempted to assassinate President Harry S. Truman at Blair House in Washington, D.C. Torresola was killed in the attempt. Collazo was captured and sentenced to death, a sentence Truman himself commuted to life in prison. In 1954, four Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire from the gallery of the U.S. House of Representatives, wounding 5 congressmen. It was a stark, violent expression of a political frustration that had been building for over 50 years. In 1952, Puerto Rico was granted a new political designation, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or in Spanish, Estado Libre Asociado, literally, the Free Associated State. Under the Commonwealth arrangement, Puerto Rico gained its own constitution, its own governor, elected by Puerto Ricans, and greater control over internal affairs. The United States reported to the United Nations that Puerto Rico had achieved self-governance, and Puerto Rico was removed from the UN's list of non-self-governing territories. But critics have long argued that Commonwealth is misleading. Puerto Rico still has no voting representation in Congress. Puerto Ricans still cannot vote for president. Congress can still override Puerto Rican law. Federal courts have ultimate jurisdiction over the island. The name Free Associated State suggests a kind of partnership between equals. Many Puerto Ricans and legal scholars argue it is nothing of the sort. In September 2017, Hurricane Maria made direct landfall over Puerto Rico as a Category 4 storm. It was the strongest hurricane to hit the island in nearly 90 years. The destruction was catastrophic. Nearly the entire power grid was destroyed. Infrastructure crumbled. The official death toll was initially reported as just 64 people, a number that was later revised by a Harvard study to nearly 3,000 deaths attributed to the storm and its aftermath. The federal government's response was widely criticized as slow and inadequate. For months, much of Puerto Rico had no electricity, no clean water, no functioning hospitals. The recovery efforts stretched on for years. As of 2023, some communities still had not fully recovered. For many observers, the Maria disaster crystallized the argument about Puerto Rico's political status. The island's residents, American citizens, had no senators to call, no presidential vote to leverage, no full seat at the table when federal disaster response decisions were being made. Would the response have been different if Puerto Rico were a state? It's impossible to say for certain, but the question, once purely academic, suddenly felt very real to millions of people. Puerto Ricans have voted on their political status multiple times. In referendums held in 2012, 2017, and 2020, majorities voted in favor of statehood. In the 2020 vote, support for statehood reached approximately 52%, a clear majority, though turnout and ballot design have been subjects of debate. There are 3 main camps in Puerto Rico's status debate. Statehood supporters argue that Puerto Rico deserves the same rights as any American state: full representation, full participation, full equality. Independence supporters argue that Puerto Rico is a distinct nation with its own language, culture, and history, and that it should chart its own course as a sovereign country. And those who support the current Commonwealth arrangement, or an enhanced version of it, argue that Puerto Rico benefits from its association with the United States while maintaining a distinct cultural identity. Each path has real trade-offs. Statehood would bring full political equality, but also full federal taxation. Independence would bring sovereignty, but also the loss of federal funding and automatic U.S. citizenship. The status quo is, for many, the least satisfying option of all. As of today, Congress has not passed legislation to admit Puerto Rico as a state. Bills have been introduced, hearings have been held, but the issue remains unresolved, caught in the gridlock of a divided Congress and the complicated politics of what it means to expand American democracy.
Puerto Rico's story is the longest and most complex, but it's not the only territory story. Let's take a quick tour of the other islands. Guam, a 212-square-mile island in the Western Pacific, has been inhabited by the indigenous Chamorro people for more than 4,000 years. Like Puerto Rico, Guam was ceded to the United States after the Spanish-American War in 1898. Guam's strategic location made it enormously valuable and enormously vulnerable. During World War II, Japan seized Guam on December 10, 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor. The Chamorro people endured nearly 3 years of brutal Japanese occupation before American forces recaptured the island in 1944. Today, roughly a third of Guam's land is occupied by U.S. military installations. Guamanians are U.S. citizens, serve in the military at extraordinarily high rates, and yet have no vote for the president who commands those forces. The irony has not been lost on the island's people. The next territory, the U.S. Virgin Islands, has a different origin story than Puerto Rico and Guam. They weren't won in battle, they were purchased. In 1917, the United States bought the islands from Denmark for $25 million in gold, at the time the most expensive land purchase in U.S. history. The strategic rationale was clear. The islands sit just 40 miles east of Puerto Rico, near the entrance to the Caribbean Sea and the Panama Canal. With World War I raging in Europe, the U.S. feared Germany might seize the islands from Denmark. Better to buy them first. Today, approximately 100,000 people live in the USVI. They are U.S. citizens, but like the residents of all other territories, they cannot vote for president. The island's economy depends heavily on tourism, and they remain among the most beautiful and most visited destinations in the Caribbean.
American Samoa has a unique distinction that sets it apart from every other U.S. territory. Its roughly 55,000 residents are classified as U.S. nationals, not U.S. citizens. They carry U.S. passports, but they do not have automatic citizenship rights. To become full U.S. citizens, American Samoans must go through the naturalization process, as if they were immigrants from a foreign country. This status has been legally challenged in recent years. Courts have grappled with whether this arrangement is constitutional, and the debate continues. The Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, meanwhile, became associated with the United States in 1978, following a UN trusteeship that began after World War II. Its residents are U.S. citizens, with a non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives, but like other U.S. territories, they cannot vote in presidential elections.
Here's one more wrinkle in the 55 story. Throughout American history, there have been states that almost were proposed, organized, sometimes even briefly governed, but never admitted to the Union.
The state of Franklin, named after Benjamin Franklin, existed in what is now eastern Tennessee from 1784 to 1788. After the Revolutionary War, settlers in the western territories of North Carolina petitioned Congress for separate statehood. For 4 years, Franklin functioned with its own government, its own courts, even its own currency. Congress rejected the application, and the territory was eventually absorbed back into North Carolina and later became part of Tennessee. The state of Transylvania was proposed in 1775, covering much of what is now Kentucky and Tennessee. Entrepreneur Richard Henderson purchased the land from the Cherokee, a transaction the colonial governments refused to recognize. The Continental Congress rejected Transylvania's statehood bid. Kentucky eventually became a state in 1792, but not as Transylvania. Perhaps most poignant of all is the state of Sequoia, proposed in 1905 for the eastern portion of what is now Oklahoma. If admitted, Sequoia would have been the first state in American history with a Native American majority, an extraordinary and historic achievement. Its constitution was drafted, its officials were elected, its capital was designated. Congress rejected it. 2 years later, eastern and western Oklahoma were combined into a single state, Oklahoma, and the majority Native American state of Sequoia was gone forever. These ghost states are a reminder that the map of the United States was never inevitable. Different decisions, different politics, different moments, and the flag might have had 52 stars, or 53, or a completely different shape.
So let's settle the question once and for all. The United States officially, legally, and constitutionally has 50 states. To become a state, a territory must submit a petition, Congress must pass an enabling act, the territory must ratify a state constitution, and both chambers of Congress must pass an act of admission. None of the 5 major territories have completed this process. The number 55 is not an official figure. It comes from a reasonable impulse. If you count all the places where people live under the American flag and are subject to American law, you get a bigger number than 50. But legally, politically, and constitutionally, it is 50. That said, the question of whether it should remain 50 or whether justice and democracy demand that it become 51 or 52 or more is not settled. It's one of the most important unresolved questions in American political life. The insular cases, those Supreme Court rulings from 1901 to 1922 that defined the legal status of territories, were built on the racial and colonial assumptions of a very different era. Several current Supreme Court justices have suggested those rulings deserve to be re-examined. Legal scholars widely regard them as among the most troubling chapters in constitutional history. The question of what America owes its territories, particularly Puerto Rico, is not just a legal question, it's a moral one.
The story of America's territories is not a footnote. It's a central chapter in the ongoing American story. A story about what this country believes about democracy, about equality, about who counts. Puerto Rico has been under American sovereignty for 125 years. Its people have served in every American war since World War I. They have contributed to American culture, American science, American art and music. Figures like Roberto Clemente, Rita Moreno, Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic and Latina Supreme Court Justice, are part of the American story because Puerto Rico is part of America. And yet, 3 million Americans on that island wake up every morning in a democracy where their voices on the biggest questions of national leadership do not fully count. The same is true for the people of Guam, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. The next time someone asks you how many states are in the United States, you can give them the official answer, 50. And then you can tell them the real answer, the one that takes 125 years of history, 4 million people, 5 islands, and one very complicated flag to explain.
If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And for more real history, be sure to check out our other videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.